The billionaire hid cameras to protect his paralyzed son until he saw what the black single dad did. Jonathan Pierce built his world on control. Hidden cameras filled the research loft where his paralyzed son, Miles, spent his days. They weren't for show, they were protection after past staff failed him. When a new maintenance worker, Darius Cole, arrived, Jonathan barely looked up. Darius was quiet, a black single dad fixing loose rails and broken vents, moving in steady patterns the cameras never missed. Jonathan watched every feed, unsure if Darius was harmless or something else. Jonathan Pierce believed structure kept everything from falling apart. After the cameras were installed, life in the research loft fell into a steady rhythm that felt more like a timed schedule than a home. Different specialists arrived, checked in, checked out, and were replaced by new faces before anyone could learn the shape of Miles's silence. Each worker followed a printed list taped to a wall, marking tasks with pens that ran out faster than their patience. Nobody stayed long enough to see who Miles was beneath the chair. They just measured, recorded, and moved on. The lead consultant, Dr. Everett Lang, walked through the loft each morning like he was entering a laboratory. He looked at graphs more than he looked at Miles. He spoke in numbers, not feelings. He tested reflexes, tracked breath rates, typed notes, and adjusted sensors. When Jonathan asked how things were going, Everett gave updates in percentages and predicted time charts. Miles sat there listening, unable to move or argue, while his emotional world stayed untouched. The room felt full of movement, yet empty of warmth, as if everything counted except the boy himself. Jonathan spent hours watching the screens in his private office, keeping his focus on spikes and dips in the data Everett collected. When Miles's breathing slowed, Jonathan sighed with relief. When it ticked up, his shoulders tightened. He gave orders to improve trackers and expand reporting, but he did not walk to his son's side. His fear of doing the wrong thing kept him frozen in the doorway. He believed observation prevented failure, yet his distance felt like another kind of failure he could not admit. Darius Cole, the black single dad hired as a maintenance worker, moved through the space without drawing attention. He checked vents, replaced filters, cleaned dust from sound panels, and fixed loose screws that others ignored. Darius greeted Miles with a soft nod when their eyes met, but he never stepped past what his job allowed. Jonathan barely noticed him, and Everett didn't look at him at all. To them, Darius was just someone who kept the space running, nothing more. Still, the cameras caught him in moments no one watched, wiping surfaces gently near Miles's chair or slowing his steps when Miles's breathing sounded uneven. Days blended together. Miles's emotional state didn't shift. The charts stayed flat where it mattered most. The loft was full of people doing work, but Miles felt alone. Jonathan wondered why nothing changed, but he kept his eyes on numbers instead of the boy who needed more than graphs. The cameras stayed on, waiting, recording everything no one talked about. Jonathan Pierce believed numbers never lied. When Dr. Everett Lang presented monthly progress charts with neat upward lines and positive trends, Jonathan nodded, telling himself things were improving. But behind those hopeful graphs, Miles's eyes told a different story. He stared through people instead of at them, responding less and less to anyone's presence. His hands didn't move, but his silence grew louder, as if each quiet day pulled him deeper inside himself. The loft was filled with machines that tracked everything, yet none of them recorded what mattered most. Everett introduced a new arm-mounted sensor that tracked pulse changes. He added a forehead strip that read electrical activity and installed breath analyzers on the chair handles. Every week, another piece of equipment arrived, strapped, taped, or clipped to Miles's body until he resembled a science project more than a person. To Everett, every device meant progress. To Jonathan, it meant control. To Miles, they were reminders that people saw his body, but never his feelings. His voice was gone, but even when he tried to communicate through glances or shallow breaths, no one slowed down enough to notice. Jonathan's office looked like a command center. Multiple screens displayed live biometric feed from Miles's sensors. Lines danced across digital panels, shifting with each breath or heart flutter, while Jonathan hunched over them like a tired guard watching for intruders no one else believed existed. When a sensor beeped unexpectedly, Jonathan hurried down the hall, checked the cables, ordered replacements, and upgraded software. But he never reached out to touch Miles's hand or sit next to him without something to fix. The cameras showed everything, yet Jonathan felt blind to the emptiness forming in his son's eyes. The air in the loft had changed. Conversations between staff were short and technical. Everett spoke like a calculator, reciting values and predictions, while Jonathan followed every word, afraid to interrupt. Miles sat quietly, his breathing steady but shallow, as if holding back everything he wanted to say. His face didn't show pain, but it didn't show joy either. It was as though someone had turned down the volume of his emotions until only a faint hum remained. Everyone claimed things were better, but that hum grew weaker each week. Darius Cole continued his work without fanfare. Some days he polished metal beams that held speakers. Other days he crouched near small vents to check airflow. Jonathan rarely looked at him, and Everett barely acknowledged his existence. Darius seemed fine with it. He walked slowly when entering the loft, listening without looking like he was listening. He didn't speak unless spoken to. Cameras caught him glancing toward Miles every so often, but he never broke the boundaries of his job. He was a background presence, unnoticed like static noise in a busy room. But Darius did something no one saw. When he reached behind a panel to tighten screws, he also shifted a small resonance plate slightly to lower the echo in the room. When he replaced filters, he changed the angle of the vents to soften air vibrations. When he wiped dust from a sound panel, he pressed a hidden adjustment on the backing to warm the frequency by a fraction. These tiny changes didn't show up on graphs. They didn't make alarms go off or cause Everett to take notes. But whenever Darius worked near Miles, the cameras recorded something else. Miles's eyes staying open a little longer, his breathing slowing as if feeling safer, his shoulders relaxing the tiniest bit before pulling back into silence again. Jonathan didn't notice. Everett didn't care. Sensors captured numbers but ignored peace. Miles drifted farther inward, while the world around him filled with screens, wires, and blind spots. Darius kept moving quietly, making tiny acoustic shifts that no one tracked but Miles seemed to sense. And the question hung in the air like a soft echo waiting to be heard. How long could emotional needs stay ignored before someone finally saw what was right in front of them? Jonathan told himself that every upgrade meant hope. He believed that tracking more signals would help him reach the day Miles could communicate again. So when Everett suggested a new headband that monitored muscle tension around the jawline, Jonathan agreed without hesitation. The band wrapped across Miles's forehead like a crown of wires. It measured every tiny clench and twitch, yet ignored every quiet tear that slipped down his cheek when no one watched. Everett called it progress. Jonathan called it protection. Miles had no name for it at all. He just endured. The loft became crowded with silent machines blinking in soft colors. New devices flashed quietly beside older models, all trying to read meaning from a body that had more stories than numbers could tell. Everett walked around writing down values, adjusting thresholds, and warning Jonathan not to interrupt the process with emotional distractions. Jonathan nodded, as if emotions were expensive and he could not afford them. He still believed devices kept Miles safe from harm. What he never asked himself was whether they also kept him away from his son. Each morning, Jonathan checked the camera feeds before work. He watched employees walk through the loft like ghosts. They cleaned surfaces, tested sensors, and recorded data. Miles sat there, eyes forward, breathing slow. Sometimes his shoulders rose for no apparent reason, then dropped, as if he had changed his mind about reacting. The sensors caught the breath changes, but the cameras caught the silence afterward. Jonathan ignored that silence because he did not know how to face it without breaking down. Everett pushed for more structure. He set strict time blocks for each metric. No smiles, no small talk, no presence beyond tasks. He repeated that emotional bonding was beyond scope. Jonathan followed that advice because it felt safer than facing his own regrets. The system grew stronger, colder, and harder to question. If anyone felt discomfort, they swallowed it quietly. It was the culture Everett built and Jonathan allowed. Meanwhile, Darius continued his maintenance rounds. He fixed small cracks in the wall, tightened support rails, and wiped dust from sensors that blinked like watchful eyes. He always moved with calm steps, as though rushing would break something fragile. When he adjusted vents or panels, he did it with a care that didn't draw attention. The cameras captured him pressing gentle pressure on the walls to feel the vibration shifts. He never spoke about what he noticed. He just acted quietly with a patience that felt out of place in the loft's rigid routine. One afternoon, Miles's jaw tightened for a moment, but the sensors didn't show distress. Everett recorded the data as normal. The cameras, however, caught something else. Darius pausing near a vent, listening to how the air moved past Miles's chair. He made a tiny adjustment, so small the camera almost missed it. Minutes later, Miles's jaw relaxed. His breathing steadied. His head tilted a fraction toward the softer sound. No one noticed. Everett didn't check the footage. Jonathan didn't review past recordings. The loft stayed full of hums and numbers, while emotional warmth stayed hidden below the surface. Miles drifted further inside himself, waiting for someone to see him beyond the machines. Jonathan pushed harder for more sensors. Everett praised the data. And Darius kept adjusting the world in secret, trying to make the air feel less lonely for a boy who could not walk away. Weeks passed like this, wires growing, silence deepening, and Miles fading between lines of code and structured care. Jonathan believed control would solve everything, but the cameras were collecting more truth than he realized. What they recorded was not danger, not chaos, not disobedience. What they recorded was a quiet battle between measurement and meaning, where one man searched for signs on screens and another listened for whispers in the air. The pressure kept building. Emotional needs stayed unseen. And something in the loft felt ready to break, yet no one knew what would crack first. The system, the silence, or the belief that numbers could hold a child's heart. For the first time in months, the numbers shifted in a way Jonathan Pierce could not ignore. Everett walked into his office with a confident stride and held out a tablet covered in rising graphs and optimistic percentages. The lines edged upward, pulse rhythms steadied, and a few markers even crossed thresholds Everett had predicted would take a year to reach. Jonathan stood taller, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Finally, something was improving. He let himself breathe. He let himself believe. Maybe all the wires, sensors, and measurements were finally paying off. Down in the loft, Miles seemed a little more alert. His eyelids stayed open a few minutes longer during morning checks, as though something in the air felt less heavy. When Jonathan saw Miles looking toward a sunlit corner of the room, he told himself it was a sign of hope. The sensors picked up a small increase in heart variability, and Everett pointed to the data like a proud teacher showing off a perfect test score. Jonathan smiled at the screen, convinced the path forward was finally clear. He told himself this was only the beginning. Everett used the moment to reinforce his methods. He spoke about consistency, discipline tracking, and strict adherence to schedules. He replayed data logs and congratulated Jonathan for funding more equipment. Jonathan listened with gratitude, thinking maybe his long fight to protect Miles had been right after all. The cameras stayed active, but Jonathan checked them less that week, choosing instead to watch graphs flow smoothly across his screens. The quiet blinking lights no longer felt like reminders of failure. For a brief time, they felt like proof of success. Meanwhile, Darius moved through the space as usual. He continued tightening bolts, adjusting sound panels, and cleaning vents. He stayed invisible enough not to interrupt, present enough to keep things working. Whenever he passed Miles, he slowed his step for half a second, but no one noticed except the cameras. Jonathan did not look back at that footage. Everett did not believe it held anything useful. The numbers provided enough comfort to ignore what was unseen. For several days, small signs of calm surrounded Miles. His breathing didn't hitch as often. His shoulders stayed lower for longer periods. His eyes stayed open long enough for Jonathan to imagine he was looking at him, not through him. Even though the improvements were quiet and brief, Jonathan felt relief bloom inside him. He started to think maybe things were finally shifting in the right direction. He thanked Everett privately and expanded his research budget again. Then the change stopped. Jonathan didn't notice at first. It happened so slowly that optimism made him blind. The graph still looked stable, not perfect, but acceptable. Everett insisted progress was steady and would continue as long as Jonathan stayed committed. Jonathan nodded, repeating those words to himself whenever doubt crept near. But the cameras caught something the graphs never showed. Miles's gaze drifting downward again, resting on nothing, like a mind closing its windows one by one. The emotional lift that had seemed so promising faded almost without sound. Miles's breathing grew tighter in the evenings. His shoulders curled slightly inward. His eyes became distant, not blank but burdened, as if the moment of relief had reminded him of what he was missing. The silence around his chair did not soften for long. It deepened, thickening like fog after a passing breeze. Jonathan stood near the threshold more often, wanting to step forward, yet holding himself back with the same fear that had always kept him away. When Everett reviewed the newest data, he nodded calmly. "Normal variation," he said, pointing at the small dips. "Expected leveling before the next rise." Jonathan clung to the explanation, repeating it internally like a lifeline. Expected leveling, expected leveling. But the words felt thin when he saw Miles's eyes dim again. Numbers explained everything except what Jonathan felt in his chest. Darius noticed before anyone else. He lingered by the acoustic panels longer than usual, pressing a hand lightly against one surface, as though feeling the heartbeat of the room. He adjusted a small pad behind a vent, shifting airflow to reduce a harsh vibration. He tightened the screws on a sound plate so it wouldn't rattle when air pressure changed. These actions didn't show up in Everett's reports. They didn't change the graphs. They didn't trigger alerts. But when Darius worked, Miles's shoulders relaxed for a moment, just a moment, before rising again. Jonathan saw the numbers stay steady, but he also saw the sadness return to his son's eyes. He wanted to believe Everett's explanation, yet something felt off. Why did Miles look heavier inside, even when the metrics claimed progress? Jonathan spent late nights staring at the screens in his office. The numbers did not match the feeling in his gut. The numbers said progress. His heart said loss. He pushed those feelings down and demanded more measurements instead of asking the questions that scared him. Everett responded by ordering another device, something to measure slight changes in body temperature along the spine. The new sensors came in sleek containers and were installed with confidence. Jonathan signed approvals quickly, hoping more data would clear the fog gathering inside him. But the loft felt colder, not warmer. The hum of machines grew louder, crowding out the small signs of emotional life that had briefly surfaced. Miles's brief lift turned into a deeper quiet, like a voice that tried to speak once but gave up when no one listened. Jonathan began walking through the loft again, watching staff move with measured steps. The smell of cleaning products filled the air, mixed with the dull metallic scent of tools. Miles sat surrounded by equipment that measured nearly everything except the ache in his silence. Jonathan opened his mouth to say something, anything, but speech felt heavier than all the machines. He turned away, convincing himself Everett would fix it, but something in his chest tightened, and this time he couldn't ignore it. The false hope had passed, leaving behind a sharper disappointment than before. Jonathan felt more helpless than the day he installed the first camera. He had believed data could save Miles, yet he felt farther from his son than ever. The cameras watched everything. The machines measured everything. But the quiet inside the loft thickened, carrying a question Jonathan did not want to face. If the numbers looked promising, why did it feel like he was losing his son all over again? The loft ran like a well-oiled machine, but something invisible was shifting beneath the surface. Darius Cole walked his maintenance route with the same slow pace, holding a small toolkit and a clipboard filled with routine checklists. To anyone else, he looked like a man doing ordinary work. He checked screws, wiped fingerprints from metal surfaces, and replaced loose bolts. But his hands always lingered a second longer near the sound panels, airflow vents, and vibration pads that framed the space around Miles's chair. The cameras saw everything. No one else did. When Darius leaned close to a vent, he pressed lightly against the side panel, listening to the way air hummed through the ducts. He adjusted the angle of a grill by half an inch, shifting the pitch so the airflow whispered instead of rasped. He slid a small felt pad behind a speaker mount and tapped it once, testing how the vibrations softened. He never wrote down what he did. He did not need to. His method was not about numbers. It was about feeling. The loft breathed differently after each tiny shift, but no tracking sheet reflected that change. Miles reacted before anyone could name what was happening. When Darius tightened a screw beneath a resonance panel, Miles's shoulders lifted and then dropped with a steady exhale. His eyelids rose longer than usual, and his gaze followed Darius's movements without urgency, as though the room finally made sense again. Miles didn't move his lips or raise his hands, but his breathing told a story that the machines around him could not translate. When Darius left the space, the calm faded slowly, like warmth slipping from a blanket. When he returned, it came back, steady and real. Jonathan Pierce did not see the pattern. He noticed only the rise and fall of numbers on Everett's charts. He followed Everett's recommendations without question, believing every small improvement came from the latest device or measurement method. When Miles looked calmer one day, Jonathan felt proud. When his son withdrew the next, Jonathan blamed himself for not doing enough. He returned again to the screens in his office, hoping graphs would speak the language of love he could not express. He looked for answers in rising bars and glowing lines, never thinking to click through older camera footage that held a different kind of truth. Everett continued his rounds like a conductor guiding an orchestra of machines. He adjusted wires, scanned reports, and entered new data into his tablet. He congratulated Jonathan on the equipment upgrades and reminded him that discipline was the key to long-term progress. Everett spoke with confidence, and Jonathan listened because certainty felt safer than doubt. The consultant held power in every room he entered. Staff obeyed his tone. Jonathan followed his lead. And Miles stayed silent beneath layers of data that tracked everything except his heart. Meanwhile, the cameras recorded Darius's path each day with tireless focus. The footage showed him kneeling under vibration pads, tilting airflow vents, and pressing lightly against sound panels to test how they absorbed noise. His changes were small, subtle, nearly invisible to anyone who did not understand why sound mattered. He never adjusted anything twice in the same way. He observed, he listened, and he responded. The cameras stored every shift and every reaction, frame by frame, unnoticed. Miles's responses were gentle but clear. Each time Darius stepped near, Miles's eyes brightened, not dramatically, but with a steadiness that lingered. His breathing slowed in rhythm with the softened hum of the room. His head tilted slightly as though he sensed a pathway opening around him, one that made space for his emotions to exist without being measured. Miles did not speak, yet something spoken moved through the room all the same. Jonathan glanced at Miles often, but never long enough to see the full pattern. His eyes always returned to the screens, searching for confirmation of progress he could not define. He told himself the charts would reveal everything in time. But the charts could not show how Miles's breathing changed when the air hummed differently, or how his gaze steadied when vibrations softened under the floor. Days passed, and the hidden emotional power shifted further toward Darius without a single announcement or argument. No report mentioned it, no meeting acknowledged it. But the cameras kept watching. They captured a quiet force shaping the loft, adjusting the atmosphere around Miles with patient hands and thoughtful silence. What Darius did could not be written into numbers because it was not data. It was connection, unspoken and unseen. And while Everett still held official authority and Jonathan still believed in charts, the loft itself began to carry a question the machines could not answer. What was Darius seeing that no one else could measure, and how long would it stay unnoticed? Jonathan Pierce stared at the newest monthly report with a weight in his chest he could not name. The numbers looked steady, the graphs held their shape, and Everett declared the results consistent with predicted patterns. But Jonathan no longer felt comfort in those words. Miles seemed trapped somewhere deeper than before, as if the earlier brief lift had only reminded him of what he could not reach again. When Jonathan walked through the loft, he saw machines blinking like quiet guards, yet all he felt was distance. His confidence thinned, but he held his doubts inside. He did not want to disturb the system he built. For weeks, Jonathan said nothing. He signed papers, approved budgets, and sat in his office staring at screens longer than he should have. He tried to convince himself that stability was a form of progress, that steady lines meant safety, that the absence of decline counted as a small victory. But every time he passed Miles in the loft, the silence felt heavier. Jonathan saw his son look past him, not at him, and something inside him tightened. He ignored the feeling, pushing it down under spreadsheets and reports. During one late night, Jonathan sat alone in his office, lights low, screens glowing. He watched the live feed again, but nothing seemed different. Miles breathed. Machines hummed. Everett's protocols continued unchanged. Jonathan's fingers hovered over the keyboard as though waiting for permission to move. He hesitated, took a slow breath, and opened the camera archive he had avoided for months. The folder felt heavier than it should. He clicked a date at random, almost afraid of what he might see. The footage played quietly. Jonathan watched routine scenes, staff cleaning, Everett checking sensors, Miles sitting still. He felt his shoulders tense. He prepared himself for signs of harm or neglect, but none appeared. Minutes passed. He leaned closer to the screen. Darius walked into frame, repairing something near a wall. Jonathan almost skipped ahead, but something in the air caught his eye. Miles's breathing changed, calmer, smoother, almost hopeful. Jonathan frowned and replayed the clip. Each time Darius adjusted something hidden from view, Miles shifted in small ways. His jaw relaxed, his eyes opened wider, his breath steadied. Jonathan clicked another file, then another, then another. He watched footage from months earlier, scenes he had ignored while chasing numbers. Each video showed the same pattern: Darius adjusting vents, tapping panels, shifting pads, and Miles reacting with subtle steadiness. Not dramatic, not miraculous, just real. Jonathan felt heat rise behind his eyes. He wiped his face quickly, unsure when the tears began. He whispered to himself without sound, as though afraid someone might hear. He paused the footage on a frame where Darius was kneeling near a sound panel, head slightly tilted, eyes focused, hands gentle. Miles's gaze was locked on him, breathing settled, shoulders lowered as if he could finally rest. Jonathan stared at the still image. The realization struck hard. Someone had been giving his son emotional care without being asked, without being praised, without needing recognition. And Jonathan had missed it because he was looking in the wrong place. He replayed the moments again and again. He saw how Darius's presence slowed the room, how Miles responded without words, how the changes were never logged or charted. This wasn't a glitch or coincidence. It was consistency, it was patience, it was care. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, feeling his world tilt. For years, he believed protection came from control, data, and measurement. He believed cameras would stop harm. He never imagined they would show him something he should have seen with his own eyes. He felt small, humbled, and ashamed of how long he had looked past the obvious. The truth was clearer than any chart he had ever trusted. Darius had been helping Miles feel safe in ways machines could not measure. He closed the footage and sat in silence, staring at the darkened screen. Everett's protocols still technically held power, but the emotional power in the room no longer belonged to him. Jonathan could not deny what he had seen. He felt something break inside him, not a violent crack, but a quiet collapse of certainty. And in that collapse, a new question formed, heavier than any report. Now that he finally saw the truth the cameras held, would he have the courage to act on it? Jonathan Pierce walked into the research loft without a tablet in his hand for the first time in months. The screens in his office still glowed behind him, but he did not turn back. He moved slowly, as though afraid of breaking the air around his son. Miles sat in his chair as always, surrounded by sensors that blinked like tiny stars, but Jonathan didn't look at them. He looked at Miles, really looked. He sat down beside him and let the silence settle. No charts, no readings, no questions, just presence. Miles didn't turn his head, but Jonathan could feel a shift. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was a softness in the space between them, a calm that didn't need to be measured or explained. Jonathan rested his hand near Miles's, not touching, only offering closeness. He stayed like that for a long time, breathing slower than he had in years. The cameras caught the moment, but for once, Jonathan wasn't thinking about what they recorded. He was thinking about everything he had missed. Everett Lang entered later that morning with a new set of printouts ready to review, but Jonathan didn't rise to greet him. He listened quietly as Everett talked through trends and projections, though the words seemed distant, like radio static from another life. Jonathan nodded politely, but did not follow the numbers with his eyes. When Everett finished, Jonathan thanked him, said nothing more, and returned his gaze to Miles. Everett hesitated, sensing a change he couldn't interpret, then left without pressing further. Jonathan didn't stop him. Darius Cole continued his work around the loft, tools in hand, expression steady. He didn't act differently. He didn't slow down or speed up. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He checked vents, wiped dust from panels, and replaced loose screws. When he passed near Miles, Jonathan noticed something he had never seen before. Miles's breathing eased the moment Darius stepped close, as though recognizing the quiet care beneath each adjustment. Jonathan didn't speak, didn't interfere. He just watched, humbled by what he had failed to understand. The loft felt less like a lab and more like a room where someone lived. Machines hummed in the background, but their noise no longer owned the air. Jonathan found himself returning to the chair beside Miles day after day, without charts or goals. Sometimes he spoke softly, sometimes he said nothing. Each time, Miles's eyes lingered a bit longer, as though giving him a second chance to listen without fear. Nothing dramatic happened. No breakthroughs, no applause, only silence that held meaning instead of emptiness. Jonathan felt the weight of regret, but also the possibility of something gentler growing in its place. He still didn't know what the future would bring. He still didn't know if he could undo the distance he created. But for the first time in a long time, he stayed present long enough to see the question that mattered most. Could dignity survive here now that someone finally recognized it? Jonathan didn't make a speech. He didn't call a meeting or prepare a statement. One quiet morning, he stepped into the loft and found Darius tightening a bracket near a vent, working with the same steady hands that had guided the room for months. Jonathan walked over, waited until Darius looked up, and thanked him in a low voice. No cameras were checked, no data printed. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything Jonathan had finally learned to see. Darius nodded once and kept working, not asking for more. Everett still sent updates, but Jonathan didn't rush to open them. The charts kept arriving, yet they held less power each day. He stopped measuring Miles's life through numbers and started showing up with presence instead. Sometimes he read aloud, sometimes he sat beside his son in silence, letting the room settle around them without a goal to reach. Miles didn't need to speak for Jonathan to understand that something in their space had shifted. His breathing stayed calmer longer. His eyes stayed open with recognition, not strain. The loft no longer felt like a lab. It felt like a place where dignity lived again. Machines still hummed, but they no longer defined the air. Jonathan stayed close, not to control, but to care. And in that shared quiet, something true held steady. Miles remained vulnerable, yet his dignity stood strong.